The young resident was rushing to the emergency room when she bumped into the security guard. As he helped her pick up scattered papers, his sleeve rolled up just enough to reveal a tattoo. Not a typical design, but a combat medic cross with wings. She froze. That symbol was only earned by one type of soldier, and suddenly, the quiet man who had been invisible for 3 years became impossible to ignore. Welcome to the True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden courage and silent service, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button. These are the voices that need to be heard. St. Mary's Hospital had seen hundreds of security guards over the years. Most lasted 6 months before moving on to easier work or better pay. But Ray Torres had been there for 3 years, 4 months and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting. He arrived each evening at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his shift started, carrying the same worn black lunch bag and weathered thermos. He never rushed, never complained, never asked for overtime. He just showed up, clocked in, and disappeared into the maze of corridors that made up the largest trauma center in the state. The staff barely noticed him anymore. To the doctors rushing between surgeries, he was just another uniform in peripheral vision. To the nurses working double shifts, he was the quiet nod in the hallway. To the administrators, he was a name on a payroll. Ray Torres was invisible, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He was 58 years old. Though the limp in his left leg made him seem older. His hair had gone completely gray, cut short in a style that never changed. His uniform was always pressed, boots always polished, security badge positioned exactly 2 inches above his left breast pocket. Everything about him spoke of order, discipline, and a man who understood the value of routines. But routines, as Ray had learned long ago, could be broken in an instant. For over 3 years, he had walked these halls and seen it all. Car accidents that arrived in screaming convoys, overdoses that came in silent and still, violence that painted trauma bays red and left families sobbing in hallways. Through it all, he remained what he had always been. The man in the background, checking doors, monitoring cameras, making sure the world outside stayed outside. That was his job. That was his purpose. That was enough. Until the night Dr. Sarah Chen changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chen was having the kind of night that made medical residents question their career choices. 14 hours on shift, 20 minutes of sleep, running on nothing but coffee and stubborn determination. The trauma bay had seen 3 major cases since midnight, and the night was far from over. She was rushing from the elevator when it happened. Her pager buzzed her phone, rang. Someone called her name. In the split second of distraction, she turned too quickly and collided with something solid and unmoving. Papers exploded from her hands like confetti. Her stethoscope went flying. Her coffee cup clattered across the linoleum with the sound of chaos. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." She started, dropping to her knees to gather scattered patient files. "I wasn't watching where I was." "No harm done, doctor." The voice was calm, steady, somehow familiar. She looked up to see the night security guard kneeling beside her, carefully collecting papers with precise movements. Ray, she thought his name was. She had seen him countless times, always in the background, always forgettable. Except now, as he reached across to gather a lab report, his sleeve pulled back from his wrist, and Sarah Chen saw something that made her world stop. A tattoo, not decorative ink, but something else entirely. A combat medic symbol, the rod of Asclepius, entwined with wings rendered in faded black ink that spoke of decades and desert sun. Below it, barely visible, were letters that made her breath catch: 18, D18, Delta, Special Forces Combat Medic. The most elite medical training the military offered. The kind of qualification that took years to earn and a lifetime to master. The kind of designation that belonged to soldiers who saved lives in places where death was the default outcome. Sarah Chen had grown up in a military family. Her father had been a Navy corpsman. She knew what that tattoo meant. She knew what those letters represented, and she knew that the quiet man who had been invisible for 3 years was anything but ordinary. Ray must have noticed her stare, because he quickly pulled his sleeve down and stood up, extending the collected papers. But his eyes, steel gray and impossibly calm, met hers for just a moment, and she saw something that made her understand why he had been invisible for so long. He was hiding, not from shame or fear, but from a past that was too heavy to carry in the open. "Your papers, doctor," he said quietly. "Thank you," she managed. "I thank you." He nodded once and turned to walk away. "Ray," she said, and he stopped. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her beyond the simple fact that he had heard his name. "That tattoo," she said carefully. "My father was a corpsman. I know what it means." For a long moment neither moved. The hallway continued its quiet nighttime rhythm, but in the space between them something had shifted. "Your father was a good man," Ray said finally. "Navy corpsmen always are." "He said the same thing about Special Forces medics," Sarah replied. "Said they were the best he ever worked with." "We all did our jobs, doctor. I'm sure you did more than that." Ray turned slightly, just enough for her to see his profile. That was a long time ago. Different life, different man. "Maybe," Sarah said. "But some things don't change." "Everything changes," Dr. Ray replied. "That's what timed as he walked away, then leaving Sarah standing alone with a stack of papers and 100 questions she didn't know how to ask. For the first time in 3 years, Ray Torres was no longer invisible. 3 hours later, the trauma alert sounded at 4:17 a.m. Incoming trauma ETA, 3 minutes. The announcement crackled. Male, approximately 35 years old, multiple blast injuries possible. IED exposure, IED improvised explosive device. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They were in suburban Pennsylvania. IED injuries weren't supposed to happen here. The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, was already gowned and gloved. Sarah pulled on protective gear, her mind racing through everything she had learned about blast injuries, construction accident. Janet, the head nurse, explained gas explosion at a demolition site. Worker was too close when it went off. The ambulance doors burst open, and Sarah got her first look at what a real explosion could do to a human being. The patient was conscious, but barely. His torso and arms were covered in cuts ranging from minor to severe, but the deep laceration along his left thigh made Sarah's breath catch. The wound was jagged, dirty, and bleeding despite pressure. Bandages, vital stable, but dropping. The paramedic reported BP down to 95 over 60. She's lost a lot of blood, and there's debris embedded in multiple wounds. Dr. Martinez began his assessment, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. This wasn't typical trauma. This required experience they didn't have. "Sarah, get me trauma surgery stat," Dr. Martinez ordered, "and call blood bank." Sarah reached for the phone, but as she did, she noticed something. Standing outside the trauma bay, barely visible through glass doors, was Ray Torres. He wasn't supposed to be there, but there he was, watching with an intensity that had nothing to do with casual curiosity. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw something new in his expression. Not the calm professionalism of a security guard, but the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. Someone who had seen these injuries before. The trauma surgeon was in another operation. The backup was dealing with a car accident. The third-string doctor was 20 minutes away. We're on our own. Sarah reported Dr. Martinez worked, but Sarah could see his frustration growing. The wounds were complex bleeding, difficult to control. The embedded debris was creating complications that required expertise none of them possessed. "This is beyond my experience." Dr. Martinez finally admitted, "I can stabilize him, but these fragments, I don't know how to extract them without causing more damage." That's when the doors opened and Ray Torres stepped inside. "Doctor," he said quietly, his voice carrying authority that seemed to come from nowhere. "May I take a look?" Dr. Martinez looked up, startled. "Ray, you can't be in here, I understand," Ray replied, moving toward surgical gloves. "But I've seen injuries like this before. Many times, Ray." "This isn't," Dr. Ray interrupted, and his tone stopped all conversation. "That man has fragmentation wounds from an explosion. The debris is creating pressure on his femoral artery. If you don't extract it properly, he's going to bleed out in 10 minutes. Dr. Martinez stared at him. "How do you know that Ray was already pulling on gloves?" "Because I spent 12 years putting soldiers back together after IED strikes in Iraq and Afghanistan." And right now, that knowledge might be the difference between this man living or dying. The trauma bay fell silent except for monitors, and the patients labored, breathing. Dr. Martinez looked at Ray, then at the patient, then back at Ray. "Are you telling me you're a doctor?" "No," Ray replied, moving to the bedside. "I'm telling you I'm a Special Forces combat medic. And this is exactly what I trained for." Dr. Martinez hesitated. Every protocol told him to refuse, but the patient's blood pressure was dropping, bleeding was getting worse, and the nearest qualified surgeon was 15 minutes away. Dr. Martinez stepped aside. "Show me," he said. Ray Torres transformed. He still looked like the same security guard, but the way he moved assessed injuries. The calm authority that emanated from him, all of it spoke of someone who had done this work in circumstances far more challenging than a hospital trauma bay. "First, we control bleeding from secondary wounds," he said steadily. "The fragments in his leg are creating tamponade. They're helping control arterial bleeding. Remove them wrong, hell exsanguinate, before we get surgical control." His hands moved with practiced precision, identifying wounds, assessing damage, prioritizing with experience that couldn't be taught in textbooks. "Dr. Martinez, pressure here," Ray said, indicating an arm laceration. "Sarah fragment near his clavicle, not life-threatening. Now, but if it shifts, could puncture subclavian artery." Sarah moved to position, applying gentle stabilization. "How do you know all this?" "Because I've seen this exact pattern. Maybe 50 times, Ray replied. "Vehicle-borne. IED close proximity. Blast creates predictable wound distribution." He worked with efficiency that spoke of muscle memory procedures, repeated under pressure until they became instinct. But there was gentleness too, care that went beyond technical competence. "Janet vascular clamp and suture material," he continued, "portable ultrasound. I want to see vessel integrity before extraction." Dr. Martinez looked up. "Ray, how long were you a combat medic?" 12 years active duty, Ray replied, using ultrasound. 3 deployments, Iraq, 2 Afghanistan, field hospitals, forward bases, more helicopter medevacs than I care to count. Why didn't you continue in medicine?" Ray paused, hands still working, but expression shifting. "Because I was tired of war. Tired of putting people back together so they could go out and get broken again. I wanted to help people where the only enemy was disease and accident, not hatred and violence. So why security?" "Because I needed to be invisible for a while," Ray said. "Needed to help without being responsible for life and death decisions, where I could just exist." The monitor showed blood pressure stabilizing. Ray nodded, satisfied. Removing fragments now in sequence, Dr. Martinez, ready with clamps. "Sarah, direct pressure on my nod. Janet, blood products ready." For 20 minutes, Ray worked with precision that transformed the trauma bay. Under his guidance, they extracted debris, controlled bleeding, stabilized injuries that had seemed insurmountable. "Last fragment," Ray announced. "This one's tricky, close to femoral artery, significant bleeding possible." His hands were steady as he grasped embedded metal rebar that had become a projectile. "Everyone ready?" They nodded. Ray extracted the fragment in one smooth motion, immediately applying pressure as blood began to flow, but it was controlled, manageable. "Got it," Dr. Martinez said, placing a clamp and suturing the vessel. "Jesus, Ray, that was good teamwork," Ray replied, stepping back and stripping off gloves. "You all did what needed to be done." Blood pressure was rising, heart rate stabilizing, bleeding controlled. They had saved a life. Dr. Martinez looked up. "Ray, wait." The security guard stopped but didn't turn. "Thank you, that man would have died without your help." Ray was quiet. "No, he would have died without all of our help. I just brought experience to the team. Experience that saved his life," Sarah added. Ray turned, and for the first time since she had known him, Sarah saw something other than careful neutrality, satisfaction, relief, and maybe the faintest trace of pride. It felt good. he admitted quietly. It felt good to use those skills for healing instead of just surviving. 6 months later, Dr. Raymond Torres, PAC, finished his shift in St. Mary's Emergency Department at 7 a.m., just like when he was a security guard. But now he walked those corridors as a physician assistant specializing in trauma medicine. The transition hadn't been easy. Months of paperwork, background checks, certification reviews. But the hospital administration had moved mountains to make it happen. Ray's combination of combat medicine and compassionate care made him invaluable. He still worked night shifts when serious cases came in, when his skills were most needed. But now, instead of being invisible, he was the person everyone looked for when the worst cases arrived. And every night, Ray Torres carried with him the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. Not invisible anymore, not hiding from his past, but using everything he had learned in service of the mission that had always driven him: saving lives. Sarah Chen, now in her final year of residency, often worked alongside him. They had developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect. "Good save tonight," she said as they finished with a motorcycle victim. "Good teamwork," Ray replied, echoing words from that first night. But now it wasn't deflection, it was truth. Ray Torres had learned something important in his journey from invisible security guard to essential trauma specialist. The best healing happens when people use their gifts not to stand apart, but to stand together. And sometimes the most important step is the courage to stop being invisible and start being exactly who you were meant to be. At the True Human Tales, we believe that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear security uniforms or medical scrubs, or the quiet dignity of someone who has found their purpose. Have you ever met someone hiding extraordinary skills behind an ordinary job? Tell us their story in the comments below. Subscribe to support our channel. We're here to share the human stories that remind us that courage, compassion, and expertise can be found in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.